Hey everyone, thanks for joining today's talk about simplifying transformation through measurement and visualization. I'd like to thank Vasco and crew for putting together the Agile Summit and allowing us to be the title sponsor. And we hope to add value today from understanding some different measurement techniques. All right, since we're Agilists and we always talk about value, let's talk about the value that we feel you're going to get today. The first thing is gaining a clear understanding of the importance and purpose of a measurement strategy. So what is a measurement strategy and how can it help you drive change? Recognizing the power of measuring practices and behaviors to drive informed decision making. So taking a look along with performance metrics at how mature are we in practices and behaviors, because putting them side by side can often lead to identifying some patterns throughout the organization that can help you drive the right conversations to drive change. And then finally, how do we collect these metrics and visualize progress to achieve desired outcomes, right? That's why we're changing. The digital age is pushing organizations to change and operate in a more collaborative and value-driven way. And we're adopting new ways of working, all for the sake of driving better outcomes. All right, the problem. So let me ask you this. Are your daily activities as a transformation leader, or maybe we call that a change agent, someone who's driving change, are you dealing with competing stakeholders who may not be aligned? Are you navigating internal politics? Do you have limited team capacity and resources that are in demand to help people work in this new way? Are you up against communication barriers where folks may not understand exactly what you're talking about? Does your organization run deep with complexity, lots of different silos, the right side not necessarily speaking to the left side? And do you have folks who are just okay with status quo and aren't interested in changing? So take a second, and if you can just put in the chat which one of these you really that really resonates with you and you really find yourself struggling with. Let me just bring up the chat. And just so you know, we will use chat throughout the session, just basically to get some more engagement and so we know where to kind of zoom in and zoom out. Resistance to change, of course, especially with line level managers. So middle management, I think we all have dealt with that. Mm-hmm. Complexity. We're going to get a lot into complexity because I think it's often overlooked. Limited team and capacity and resources. There's never enough coaches to go around, right? So how do we help? How do we optimize our time and optimize the time of our resources? And good old internal politics. We all know that no matter where you're at, you're always going to have politics, people competing. So how are you feeling? Do you feel like you're making progress? Do you feel all the players are on board, all the players needed to make this change successful? Do you feel like people are listening? Is your voice being heard? Are you hitting a roadblock? Are your days frustrating? I know in dealing with transformations for over 10 years that I often found myself being very frustrated. And the important thing is we're not alone here. According to this Forbes article released last March, okay, and as a result of working with McKinsey, BCG, KPMG, and Bain & Company, the risk of failure of a transformation, and failure being it's not delivering the benefits, is anywhere between 70 and 95%. I'm sure many of you have seen that. So we're up against it. It's not just us. And you're not alone in this fight. And in speaking to our clients at Lean Agile Intelligence, there's three patterns that we see on why change agents, transformation leaders aren't moving the needle. The first is that a lot of the stakeholders that are engaged don't necessarily understand the magnitude of this change. I'm sure many of you can attest that many see this as a delivery process, Agile, if you will, Scrum. What they don't understand is the ripple effects of forming a team and having that team work together throughout the organization. Some examples would be performance reviews, right? If we're saying the individuals aren't, if we're focusing more on teams and not individuals, then we need to shape our performance reviews to be team-centric. Another one would be the funding model. We all struggle with the project funding model. As we try to transition the product, we want to be product-driven teams. Contracts with vendors, often a black box when we really need to inspect and adapt. So there are a lot of the ripple effects that we see by just standing up these teams. And not everyone truly understands that impact. The other thing that we see a lot is folks don't necessarily understand where are we at on this journey, right? What's next? Do we want to pursue that next step, right? And who needs to be part of the effort to achieve our goals? Finally, and it's really about lack of alignment on the outcomes, right? A lack of understanding on the why. And that's sad, right? Why are we changing? What is it that we want to achieve? And how are we going to measure that to ensure we're achieving it? So these are the common patterns that we see in organizations. Question for you. Which one of these patterns do you see in your organization resonate the most? So if you can just pop that in the chat, we're interested.
A lot of lack of understanding. Why are we doing this? All three.
All three. Lack of alignment. Well, I think it's safe to say that you've all seen some of these patterns in one way, shape, or form. And as we move forward here, the reality is this really isn't a surprise, right? Organizations are complex adaptive systems. They are siloed, there's different areas, and there's human beings that are working within them. And a complex adaptive system is a series of components. You can call them the areas that I was talking about that need to dynamically interact with one another. And so when you change one, there's a ripple effect throughout it. And that's that lack of understanding that it's not just a delivery process. The other piece here is transformation. You can't see it, feel it. Okay, it's not tangible. And really, no one knows, most stakeholders don't know what the destination is. So being able to show progress is difficult. So we are up against it, my friends. Turning this complexity into something that is understood by everyone is really, really hard to do. I've been in consulting, Agile coaching, for about 13 years. I am a self-proclaimed data nerd, and I believe in the power of data to tell a story and drive the alignment. So many, many moons ago, I had the natural inclination to start to lean on metrics, data of all types, to really start to drive and visualize the change, give people something to anchor to. And I've had much more success in doing that than I did without it. If anything, it just makes the change transparent. It doesn't always mean that the stakeholders are going to embark in that next step. However, they know there's a next step, right? And that's always been the difference. And I can't begin to tell you how many times that an organization wasn't necessarily ready to take that next step in their transformation. Sure, they stood up some teams and they were delivering, but there was other things to do within the ecosystem. And they came back to me 2-3 years later saying, we're ready. And so keep that in mind, right? But as a change agent, as a transformation leader, our job is to make sure they understand the next step. So we embarked in building out Lean Agile Intelligence going back to 2017. And we're not going to cover the product, but we are going to cover some concepts that can help you drive change. And hopefully you can get some value out of that. So we have to tame the complexity, right? We have to make stakeholders and the participants, the people on the ground floor, feel comfortable with this change. To do that, we need to simplify it. We've talked a lot about complexity already. We need to create clarity on where we're at in this journey. What's next? We need to get alignment on the different stakeholders about what is it that we're after and how are we going to measure it? And then we need to be able to visualize the change so we have something to anchor to and see trends and identify cause and effect. So the construct that has enabled me to do this is what we call measurement strategy. And a measurement strategy looks at the different dimensions of any type of change, right? Or ways of working change, we should say. In today's digital economy, right? Everyone is adopting agile ways of working. DevOps is very, very prevalent, technical excellence. Something that's often missed is how are we behaving? How do we interact with one another? Because that is as important to this type of change than anything. Are we getting feedback from our customers in the form of metrics? Are our employees engaged? Are they happy? Are they going to stick around? Would they recommend our organization to somebody else? OKRs, right? We've all seen the OKR movement, but are organizations using them in the right fashion? Is it truly objectives and outcomes that they're measuring? And then finally, the performance metrics, things like DORA metrics, which is DevOps related. Flow has become very, very prevalent. So these are all the different types of dimensions that we should be looking at as part of any type of transformation effort. And once we start to gather the data and start to actually measure over points in time, it's much easier to visualize the change. It's something I like to call anchor to, that we can use to help manage the transformation, or at least drive conversation about what is it that we're after. What do we see? Your organization is unique. It's complex, but it's different than the organization down the street. And because it's such a complex adaptive system, what works down the street may not work at your place. So that's why it's so important to be able to identify and measure these things, because if there was a one size fits all, we would have figured that out by now. So when you start to look at these different dimensions, you'll start to gain insights. Those insights will start to help drive the clarity that stakeholders are typically looking for. It'll drive the conversation to help them be aligned, and they'll determine on whether or not they want to take that next step. Now, I know I'm simplifying in that, but again, the key is you're making the change transparent, okay? You're driving the conversation, and you're orchestrating alignment. And we're going to talk a lot about later on, if you lead with outcomes, a lot of times it's much easier to move the needle because it's hard to argue with outcomes. People will be resistant to change, be resistance to new ways of working. But if you lead with this is what we want to achieve and back into the new ways of working, from my experience, you have a better chance of driving change. All right, so how is this applied? So just so we're clear, measurement strategy can be applied to any level of the organization. You can see here that these dimensions can be applied no matter where you're at in the stack of the organization, whether it be at the highest level, the organization level, a business portfolio, a team of teams, right? Maybe you're running release trains and using SAFe. Teams, obviously, right? and individuals. This concept can be applied to every level of the organization. For today's talk, to simplify, we're going to focus on teams. And the reason that we're going to focus on teams is it's really the cornerstone of your organizational system, your delivery, the core construct of any type of organization is the teams. And if you focus on teams, and we would encourage you to focus on teams first, and you start to aggregate the data, it will tell you a lot about the ecosystem of the organization. You'll start to identify patterns of challenges teams are having that are out of their control. You'll start to identify who needs the most help, right? We talked a little bit about resource constraints. Where should we be spending our time? What type of problems can we tackle at scale? And as you become more and more mature, you start to then alleviate those constraints throughout the organization. Tough to do, but again, if you make it transparent, you are driving the conversation. All right, let's do a little bit of a deep dive into the dimensions because we've really just broadly brushed over them. And what we mean by dimensions of measurement strategy is really a logical grouping of metrics. And at the highest level, we categorize these into two areas: qualitative, which is more subjective, okay, and quantitative, which is more objective, very data-driven, right? The qualitative side of things, continuous improvement practices. This could be things like Scrum, Kanban. We are focusing on delivering the right things. Some of the more popular continuous improvement practices, whether it be from Scrum, Kanban, design thinking, systems thinking, right? It's all about delivering the most important thing and understanding who your customer is. So things like discovery. Are we testing out ideas with our actual customer? Prioritization. Are we using things like cost of delay to determine what's the most important thing? Or are we just building the thing that for the person who's yelling the loudest? Iterative planning. Are we baking in a cadence that allows us to adapt to changing needs? Backlog refinement. Right people, right time to really get that backlog to be healthy and ready for execution of the team. They're pretty much the most popular from a continuous improvement practice, tends to be focused on. A lot of times, organizations don't necessarily focus on the behaviors that are needed for these teams to be successful and these organizations to be successful. So collaboration. Are we bringing down the functional silos? Accountability. Is everyone owning up to their role on the team? Enablement. Are leaders enabling, creating an environment where teams can succeed? And safety. We've also seen Project Aristotle from Google, which says the most important team characteristic is whether or not they feel safe. And then DevOps practices. So DevOps has been a fast follow, if you will, to Agile ways of working. And the thing I like about DevOps is it focuses on the technical aspect that's often overlooked. We tend to get enamored with the practices and the process, but it's the DevOps practices, the technical excellence that is so needed. Things like continuous integration, integrating early and often across across the components, deployment, being able to automatically deploy, and automated testing, being able to run test not manually. So they're the quality, and we're going to dive a little bit into there. But before we do that, let's look at the quantitative sides of things. So the performance metrics, cycle time and throughput, they are what we call flow metrics, right? Becoming very popular in the industry. Test automation, how much test coverage do we have that's automated? Change failure rate is a DORA metric that's become very popular in the industry. We also need to look at other quantitative metrics such as employee morale. And what well, what we use at LAI is the ENPS, that's Employee Net Promoter Score, which just basically says, would employees recommend this this organization to their friends or colleagues? So it's using the same thing as a Net Promoter Score, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but to canvass the employees of an organization. Net Promoter Score is what we use for customer feedback. And if people aren't aware of what NPS is, we can obviously cover that later. But it's a great way, and this very much aligns to what we're trying to achieve here, to simplify how our customers are feeling. And then finally, objectives and key results, OKRs. And keep in mind, they should really be measuring the objectives of an organization and a team. So what I would call the outcomes, retention rate. Are our clients signing back up? Are customers signing back up? Are we converting new customers? Do we have reliable practices that defects are not getting into production? Are new features being adopted? They're OKRs. I would say, from my experience, most organizations measure the performance metrics, cycle time, and I'm really talking about how our teams performing from a predictability, time to market, quality standpoint. And the reason that most organizations do is because pretty much your backlog management system, Jira, Azure DevOps, Rally, whatever it may be, helps you do that, right? So most companies will measure performance metrics. Some examples. Deployment frequency is something that is a DORA metric, which is now owned by Google. And it just looks at how often are we actually deploying to production, right? And releasing fixes or enhancements to our users. The one thing I want to highlight here is the scale. One of the easiest ways to simplify measurement is to be on the same rating scale. Has anyone tried to ever show a cumulative flow diagram to an executive? It's a hard conversation to have. But instead, if everyone understands that emerging's pretty good and adapting's really good and optimizing is awesome, we can really just have a much more simpler conversation. And if you can put everything on that same scale, you've automatically simplified things, and you can really start to look at the trends and the cause and effect. The one below here is team backlog item cycle time, right? How much time actually elapsed when from the start of a piece of work to when it is finished, right? Because the more time, the more variability. That's why. Now, there's been a big OKR movement in the new ways of working space, let's call it that. And I've seen a lot of organizations get better at measuring, getting feedback from their employees, getting feedback from their customers in the form of a NPS, or there's many other metrics out there, but I think NPS would be the most common. As well as really starting to try to measure their objectives with key results, i.e. objectives and key results, OKRs. So some of the examples would be, and again, you can see the scale here, is Team Promoter Score. And this is how we do it in LAI. It's just a way to rate whether or not you would recommend the services or product of this team to a colleague. We're also able to create OKRs. This is an example of an onboarding OKR into a outward-facing application in which we're measuring the time that they spend on the payment screen, right? So this is, again, something that we're basically creating ranges, and the team or the product, depending at what level you are, is going to fall within one of these stages. And we'll show you how this all comes together. Now, few measure the continuous improvement practices, the behaviors, the DevOps, because the qualitative side of things. Some may try to run assessments. I know there's obviously LAI helps you do that, and I know we have other competitors, but it's been my experience that this is often overlooked. And the reason that it's often overlooked is it's hard to do. Okay. They don't necessarily know how. They don't really think it's important. And again, it's not as easy as just getting some data out of a Agile lifecycle management tool. What the reality is, you need to look at all of these together. We need to have a comprehensive, holistic approach so we can identify what are the challenges within the ecosystem, within the teams that are causing the metrics to move in whatever direction they are. Okay. Right. We have to be able to identify continuous improvements. We need to be able to have an improvement plan that's going to allow us and our organization to get better so that we can move the needle on OKRs, customer feedback metrics, employee morale. We need to look at this holistically so that we can identify improvements. So just a quick stop here. I'm interested to understand, what is your organization measuring? And I'll stay on this slide. Interested to know what they're measuring and what they're not measuring. So let's just take 30 seconds, and if you can update chat, that would help.
Thanks, Matt. So additionally, we did a call to action in the chat. So if you'd like to receive a recording after this, we can send that out as well. So what are you all measuring? Maybe what would you like to measure that you're not measuring even? And if you'd like to talk about it, feel free to raise your hand and we can open up allowing the talk, because sometimes it's complex, right? Yeah. Self-awareness is key, right?
Okay. OKRs, that's good. So there you go. Some validated learning that some organizations are moving to OKRs. Looks like they also looking at flow metrics such as throughput. Would love to do employee morale, EMPS.
Mm-hmm.
Is anyone measuring or doing any type of team health checks on the qualitative side of things? Whether it's in Excel or a tool. Is anyone taking a look at that? Is it being measured?
Greg, a lot of people, or I'm sorry, Jeff, a lot of people are in your boat of using the version of OKRs. That's okay. You have to start somewhere.
Right, right. Okay, so some teams it does look like some folks are doing Agile assessments. And yes, retrospectives is important, 100%. To be able to look back on the past, let's just say 2 weeks, and identify what didn't go right, what did go right, and celebrate. But also to course correct, right? Good, that's great feedback. Thank you. So LAI is this is how we measure the qualitative aspect of things. And usually most of our clients will use this as have the team actually self-assess themselves with a really good facilitator, either once a quarter or once every 6 months. And unlike retrospectives, it's a way to actually hold up a mirror to yourself and say, what does not so good look like in this practice? What does really awesome look like? And pressure test, are we doing the things along the way? And what can we do better? I like to say teams and some facilitators don't necessarily know what they don't know. So, how can we enable them? How can we empower them to self organize around these changes? And so, self assessments is a learning tool. It's an ability to say, where are we at in our journey on this practice, on this behavior, and what can we do better? That's the importance of it. This is team accountability, right? This is a behavior. Does everyone have say in our commitments? Do we have clarity on our roles? Do we have working agreements that were co-created by our team members? It's good every once in a while to really sit back and self-assess ourselves, because it really drives the rich conversation amongst teams to uncover misinterpretations, and actually get out on the table the assumptions that often are in teams that don't always come up in retrospectives. And DevOps. What does really mature DevOps practices look like? What are the steps along the way that we should be taking? Because we know we're not going to get to end all be all on day one, but what are the small steps that we can make to get better? Because the reality is, the more you bake in continuous improvement into your sprint work, the faster you're going to go in the future. I know that's hard to explain because you may have to slow down now to go faster in the future. And I know continuous improvement work often gets overlooked in organizations. However, if we can put our continuous improvement work along in our backlog, because it is work, and make it transparent and what the value is, it tends to drive the right conversations. So just to recap, measuring practices and behavior. So when you look at practices and behaviors along with all the other metrics, you can really start to identify cause and effect. What's actually moving the needle and what's not. As change agents, we can impact those practices very early on in a transformation. That's where we can have a lot of influence in helping teams. As you aggregate and roll up and become more mature, you'll be able to identify patterns throughout the ecosystem that you can use as data to show to stakeholders, leadership, about some of the problems within the ecosystem that are preventing the teams from delivering. And then to help hold the coaches accountable, to inform coaching plans. What are you going to do to move the needle with this team? Here's an example that we have of everything we've just talked about. And this is a spider graph that we have in LAI. And you can see up top here, you have your DevOps practices, and each one of these pies represents a practice, right? These are the continuous improvement practices, common goals, flow of value. Down here, you have your behavior. So leadership enablement is one, synergies, collaboration, accountability, sustainable pace. Here you have your performance metrics. So it's starting to look at deployment frequency, what we saw, lead time for changes. So another DORA metric, mean time to recovery, and team backlog item work in progress, which is a flow metric. Here's your consumer promoter score and your team promoter score. And then finally, your OKRs. And you can see each one of these lines is a point in time in which the team evaluated all of these questions. And you can start to see the trends. And this is from one of the production environments. And what's really interesting about this, and it always tends to stand out, is these teams are doing really good practices, right? So they're, all of these seem to be getting much, much better. DevOps, they're maturing. Leadership is enabling, but it looks like a lot of the team members are not feeling so hot. The feedback from the customers is they're not doing so hot. And probably most importantly, your OKRs have not moved. So here we are doing all of these practices really, really well. However, it's not moving the needle. And this is where we can really start to look at what is it we need to improve. One example here could be discovery. Some of the product stuff over here is not moving. The team's behaviors aren't necessarily moving. And so it's really about getting those insights to say, why aren't we moving the needle on our OKRs? Maybe it's just not practices. All right, the last piece of this is overlaying outcomes. And these are all the outcomes that every organization that wants to be successful in the digital age is trying to get to, right? Customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, predictability, innovation, reliability, time to market, responsiveness, and growth and revenue. We hear leaders talk about that all the time. These are the outcomes, and I like to call them transformation outcomes, that we are after, right, as a part of our delivery model. That's just what we're after as a result of undergoing the transformation, right? So an input to improvement should be the outcomes that you want to achieve. Keep in mind, your organization is much different than any of other organizations. Your organization is unique. That will help shape your measurement strategy. Improve in the things that you need to improve on to drive the right outcomes. It's not one size fits all. So that's an input to what is it you want to achieve is an input. What's fit for your purpose? Whenever you're looking at outcomes, it's always good, any metric, to look at multiple categories, multiple frameworks aligned to outcomes. So this is what we call a bounce metric framework, where we have 3 outcomes that a specific organization is after, either in the short term or the long term. The reason this helps is the data is the data, right? So it's going to mitigate your bias and misinterpretations. It's going to drive trade-off decisions, right? What's giving our context and what we're trying to achieve? What do we need to sacrifice to achieve that ultimate goal? And actually identifying some hitting improvements. And this is a simple dashboard based off of outcomes. And I'll tell you, whenever I start to talk to transformation leaders, a big part of the problem is we're leading with these agile metrics, velocity, or whatever it may be, and just simply turning it on its head and leading with these outcome driven metrics, right? So customer satisfaction, retention, conversion, net promoter score, time to market. Are we deploying? Are we getting the most out of our people from a throughput perspective? Are things moving quickly so there's not a lot of variability? And then reliability. Do we have a reliable solution? The thing that's missing here, and I want to be conscious of your time, we have 6 minutes, is what if you overlaid practices and behaviors? Because they impact outcomes, right? Now you can start to see, right, why isn't some of our metrics moving in the right direction? I always go back to very customer centricity, things like discovery. Do we understand who our customer is, right? How are we doing in that practice if we rate ourselves? There's the challenges of really putting these side by side, but once you have one single scale, that's what allows you to put everything side by side. Then you can see, as we start to carve these things up, you now have these are the dimensions. You have your OKRs, you have your performance, right? You have your practices, and you have your behaviors. Again, we are now looking at a more comprehensive view to really start driving the conversation towards what is it that we want to experiment with next that's really going to allow us to achieve our outcome. That's being a change agent. The idea of experimenting, doing something small that'll help move the needle, or not, that's why it's an experiment, in the outcome. One example that you'll see here is here's a team or maybe a product team that looks like they're going super fast, right? Their deployment frequency is going through, their throughput is great, cycle time, they're collaborating, they're probably using some type of Kanban method to really get work flowing through the system. At the same time, they're losing customers. Their retention rate is down. The feedback has been not so hot. And again, they're not doing so hot on the practices that'll help drive that. And it's the same thing with reliability. They're going fast, but if you can see, their escape defects are up. Their failure rate is up. And again, their integration testing and technical debt is not doing so hot. So these things tend to pull on one another. That's why it's important to carve them out and have a balanced approach so that you can start to see what are the trade-offs that we need to make. Jess, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so before we jump into this, we did have one question, or should I say statement in chat, and I think it might be good to talk about a little bit. Disliking the word transformation and how that kind of feels like it's signaling an end state. Mike, do you want to talk about that for a second? Well, I dropped the link inside.
Yeah, that's amazing. Me and Jess went back and forth about where we're going to call it transformation or continuous improvement, because me and Jess are adequate that it's about continuous improvement, right? If this is all about creating value for our customers, the transformation or the continuous improvement never will end. We're always has an opportunity to get better and to improve, right? So yes, transformation implies, okay, we stood up these number of teams, we're done. And we're seeing that a lot in the industry. We need to embed a continuous improvement process that just continues to look at the data and identify improvements. That's what we're really after. And to make that part of who you are, part of your DNA.
Yeah. Yeah, to add to that, the kind of analogy we like to use is when we're looking at continuously improving ourselves, what are the dials we have to look at, right? It's no different for an organization. What outcomes does the organization need to go after? And when you stop looking at any of those important dials, what happens? What happens when we stop looking at our fitness, our emotional health, right? What are we actually fueling our body with? Is it crap, right? So really what we're trying to do is take those same kind of metrics about ourselves and say, how do you apply that to an organization based on the outcomes that you want? So with that said, Lean Agile Intelligence is extending our typical 3-week trial to use our product. We're extending it to 6 weeks just for celebrating this Agile Online Summit. We hope that you all got a ton of value out of today. We'd love to hear in the chat. We have one piece of feedback that I love. For perception issues, all good, bad signals need clear icons. Totally. Yep. But feel free to add some feedback in there. If you'd like to receive a recording of this, go ahead and send us your email. We might cut some things just to make it flow easier for you, but we'll definitely send that out to you. And if you've got any additional questions, by the way, if you don't use the link that I dropped in chat and you find yourself on our website and you want to sign up, just make sure you add that promo code in, Agile Summit 6W for 6 weeks, and then you'll get that 6-week trial. Lastly, Mike, if you want to close us out with a Q&A.
Yeah, for sure. So if anyone has any questions, we are happy to stick around. We have time just to talk about any specifics or talk about our experiences or anything that you want to talk about.
Yep. And feel free to raise your hand as a participant and we'll open up the line so this way you can speak to us. I'm getting lots of emails. Thank you. Glad you loved the content. And if you didn't, let us know.
We practice what we preach.
Yes, Jason. Welcome.
Hi there. I was just curious, what are some of the tools that you're using to make some of those graphs?
So that's actually our tool. It's called Lean Agile Intelligence, and it's www.leanagileintelligence.com. Yeah, so it's a continuous improvement platform that allows you to measure practices and behaviors, and then bring in the quantitative metrics from a Jira or an Azure DevOps. So that's what Jess was referring to for the 6-week free trial. Usually it's only 3, but we extend it for participants here.
Jason, did you have any follow-up to that question?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. All right.
Cool. Well, we want to thank everyone for your time. I hope you were able to extract some value. I know this type of topic could be a bit overwhelming, so hopefully we've simplified it a little bit for you. And we are always opening to continue the conversation on how we can help you.
Yeah, I dropped our email in the chat. So if you do have questions following this, you can email us at team@leanagileintelligence.com.